My wife cheated on me with my boss, and now their lives will never be the same. My name is Michael. I was 34 years old when all of this began. At the time, there was nothing dramatic about my life. No chaos, no instability. If you looked at it from the outside, you would have probably called it successful. I worked at a mid-sized company in the city. Not a startup. Not a corporation everyone recognizes. An office job with structure. Clear departments. Clear rules. I had been there just under 4 years. Long enough to be trusted. Long enough to be comfortable. I wasn't management, but I wasn't replaceable either. I had projects, responsibilities, people who relied on my work. My boss was the kind of man everyone noticed without him trying. Confident, well-spoken, always calm. In meetings, he rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. He would listen while everyone else talked, then speak last. And whatever he said became the decision. People respected him. Executives, clients, employees, including me. At home, I had a wife and 2 kids. We had been together since college, not one of those rushed relationships. We built everything slowly. Small apartments, used furniture, long nights where we worried about money. There were years when we barely stayed ahead. Years when every unexpected expense felt dangerous. But we survived all of it together. Eventually, things stabilized. We bought a house, signed a mortgage, settled into routines. School drop-offs in the morning, work during the day, dinner together in the evening. Nothing exciting, but it felt earned. I trusted my life. That's important to understand. I didn't feel suspicious. I didn't feel insecure. I wasn't looking for problems. My wife sometimes stopped by my office. Not often, just occasionally. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes she just waved and left. Everyone knew everyone's spouses. My boss knew her. She knew my coworkers. There was nothing strange about it. That's why I never questioned anything. Not once. We ate breakfast together most mornings, talked about schedules, talked about the kids. We planned weekends weeks in advance, birthdays, vacations we never quite took. If someone had asked me back then whether I was worried about my marriage or my job, I would have laughed. Because betrayal doesn't announce itself. It doesn't start with a warning. It blends in. It hides inside normal days, inside routines, inside trust. Back then, I didn't know that. I didn't know that very soon I would be forced to look at my own life and realize that decisions were being made without me ever being part of them, and that I would have to pretend I didn't know what was happening long enough to make sure I didn't lose everything. The first thing that changed wasn't a secret. It was timing. Not enough to alarm me, just enough to feel off. My wife started coming home a little later than usual. Not late, just later. 10 minutes, sometimes 20. She always had a reason. Traffic, a stop at the store, a conversation that ran longer than expected. All reasonable. And that was the problem. Nothing stood out on its own. Everything made sense. But the feelings started stacking. I began noticing overlaps. Days when my wife said she'd be busy late lined up with days when my boss stayed late too. I didn't connect them yet. I didn't want to. It felt easier to believe that adulthood just does this to people. That schedules stop lining up. That lives drift slightly out of sync. I remember one evening standing in the kitchen watching my wife pack leftovers into containers. She looked focused, calm, and I thought, when did we stop checking in with each other? Not arguing, not fighting, just assuming. At work, I overheard a conversation between 2 coworkers talking about a meeting I wasn't invited to. My name came up. Not negatively, not critically, just as if I wasn't there, like a fixed detail. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I walked back to my desk and stared at my screen longer than necessary. That was the first time I felt something shift inside me. Not suspicion. Distance. Like I was slowly being moved to the edge of my own life without anyone needing to explain why. That night, I asked my wife how her day was. She answered quickly, briefly, then asked me the same question without waiting for my response. We went to bed without talking much. I lay there in the dark, listening to her breathe, and tried to pinpoint exactly when things started to feel different. I couldn't, because nothing had broken yet. Nothing obvious. Everything was still intact, which meant whatever was happening carefully. And that scared me more than if something had gone wrong all at once. That Thursday started like every other day. No warning signs, no arguments, no tension, just routine. I left the house early, dropped the kids off at school, kissed my wife on the cheek before heading out. She reminded me about dinner plans for the weekend. I said we'd figure it out. Nothing felt fragile. At work, the day moved slowly. Emails, calls, small meetings that didn't go anywhere. Around mid-afternoon, my boss stopped by my desk. He didn't sit down, just stood there for a moment. He asked if I could stay a bit late. There was nothing unusual about the request. Deadlines were close. Projects stacked. I agreed without hesitation. Around 6, I texted my wife to let her know. She replied almost immediately. "No problem. I'll put the kids to bed." That message stayed on my screen longer than it should have. We worked quietly for another hour. At some point, my boss checked his watch, closed his laptop, and said he was done for the night. He left without rushing, without explaining. I finished up, shut everything down, and gathered my things. The office was nearly empty by the time I reached the elevator. The ride down felt longer than usual. The garage was quiet. Concrete floors, rows of parked cars, fluorescent lights humming overhead. As I walked between the rows, something familiar caught my eye. A shape, a color. I slowed down, then stopped. Her car. At first I told myself I was wrong. Same model, same color. That didn't mean anything by itself. There were hundreds of cars in this garage. Statistically, it meant nothing. For a second, I almost laughed at myself. Then I stepped closer, and I saw the scratch on the rear bumper. Long, faded. The one I had seen 1,000 times. The one she always said she'd fix next month. My stomach tightened. My wife never came to my office this late. Not without telling me. Not without a reason. I stood there, staring at the car, trying to force a normal explanation. Maybe she needed something. Maybe she was waiting for me. Then I noticed something else. There were no license plates, not in the back, not in the front. Both were gone. That didn't make sense. She had never taken them off before. Not once. Not for parking. Not for repairs. That was the moment the feeling changed. Not shock. Not anger. Alertness. I stepped back toward a concrete pillar without fully deciding to. I waited. Minutes passed. The garage stayed quiet. Then I heard footsteps. Someone walking with purpose, not hesitating. I recognized the pace before I saw the face. My boss. He walked into the garage calmly, not checking his phone, not looking around, like he'd done this before. He went straight to her car, opened the passenger door, and got in. That was it. No conversation, no hesitation, just familiarity. Everything slowed down, not dramatically, not loudly. Clearly, I didn't feel anger yet. I didn't feel panic. I felt certainty. I stayed where I was and watched the car pull out of the garage. No plates, no rush, just the tail lights disappearing into the dark. I didn't follow them. I didn't call her. I drove home. The house was quiet when I walked in. Lights off. Kids asleep. She wasn't there. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. When she came home, it was late. Later than she said she would. She stopped when she saw me sitting there. Not guilty. Surprised. She asked why I was still up. I asked where she'd been. She paused. Just for a second. But that second answered every question. She said she'd gone out with a friend, someone from work. I nodded. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't accuse her. That confused her more than anger ever could. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed everything, every late meeting, every visit to my office, every moment that suddenly made sense, and one thought kept returning. Whatever this was, it hadn't started tonight. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. I didn't change my routine. That was deliberate. Because what I saw the night before was enough to raise suspicion. But suspicion isn't certainty. And certainty is the difference between reacting and acting. At breakfast, I behaved normally. Asked the kids about school, commented on the weather, talked about work. My wife watched me closely, not nervously, carefully, like she was waiting for something. I gave her nothing. When I got to the office, I did the same. Answered emails, joined meetings, took notes. My boss acted exactly as he always had, confident, relaxed, untouchable. If anything, he seemed more at ease than usual. That told me something important. They thought they were safe. If I had reacted the night before, if I had yelled, accused, demanded explanations, they would have adjusted. Instead, my silence made them careless. So I started verifying. Not dramatically, not illegally, methodically. The first thing I checked was our shared bank account. Not to spy. To understand. There were no huge transfers, no obvious red flags, just small charges. A hotel I didn't recognize. Not expensive, not suspicious on its own. Until I scrolled. There were 3 charges, different dates, same hotel chain, all on weekdays. I opened the calendar. Each charge lined up perfectly with nights she'd come home late or said she had work things. I took screenshots. Then I checked our phone plan, call logs, time stamps. One number appeared again and again. Always late. Always after the kids were asleep. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because even then, part of me wanted to be wrong. But I wasn't. It was my boss's number. That's when the story in my head stopped being hypothetical. Still, I didn't stop there. That afternoon, I drove back to the garage. Same building, same lighting. I went to the security desk and asked about footage from the night before. I didn't say my wife. I didn't say my boss. I said my car had been parked nearby and I needed a time window. They didn't show me everything. Just enough. Her car, no plates. His face, clear, familiar. Not getting into the car like a coworker, like someone who belonged there. I thanked them and left. On the way home, I drove past the hotel. Didn't park. Didn't go inside. Just needed to see it. To confirm it existed outside my imagination. That night, I went one step further. I waited. Across the street. In my car. Less than an hour later, I saw them. Not rushing, not hiding, walking together. Close, comfortable, like this wasn't new. I took one photo. Just one. Not for revenge. For clarity. Then I went home. When my wife smiled at me that evening, I smiled back. Because now I wasn't guessing anymore. Now I knew. And knowing changed everything. From that moment on, I stopped asking myself if something was happening, and started planning what I was going to do about it. The hardest part wasn't discovering the truth. It was living with it and pretending nothing had changed. The next few weeks passed quietly. too quietly. At home, I stayed the same. I woke up at the same time, made coffee, packed lunches for the kids. I asked my wife about her day, listened, nodded. She talked freely. That was the part I didn't expect. Once she realized I wasn't reacting, she relaxed. She stopped being careful with her words, stopped watching my face as closely. She talked about work more, about stress, about people I already knew were involved. And every time she spoke, she gave away more than she realized. At night, I lay next to her in bed, awake, listening to her breathe. Sometimes she'd fall asleep, smiling. I stared at the ceiling and wondered how long this had been going on before I noticed. At work, I did the same. I let my boss talk over me in meetings, take credit for my ideas, redirect questions meant for me. Every instinct told me to push back. I didn't. Because every time I stayed quiet, he became sloppier. He stopped documenting decisions, started approving things verbally, assumed no one would question him. I noticed patterns. Projects reassigned without explanation, complaints that disappeared before HR ever followed up, people he favored moving ahead faster than they should have. I wrote everything down, dates, times, rooms, witnesses, not because I knew exactly how I'd use it, but because I knew I would. Weeks turned into months. At home, my wife grew more distant, not cold, confident. She stopped pretending things were perfect, stopped checking in as much. It was like she had already moved on while still living in the same house. That realization hurt more than the betrayal itself. At work, my boss began easing me out. Less visibility, fewer responsibilities, smaller roles in meetings. That was the moment something shifted. Because now, it wasn't just personal, it was professional. And that changed the rules. I spoke to a lawyer, not about revenge, about protection, custody, assets, documentation. I learned something that stayed with me. If I reacted emotionally, I could lose my kids. If I waited and let the truth surface properly, I wouldn't. So I waited. I continued collecting evidence, not just of the affair, but of abuse of power, conflict of interest, favoritism, policy violations, things companies don't ignore. There were nights I almost broke, moments when she laughed at something on her phone and I wanted to ask who it was, moments when my boss smiled at me in the hallway and I wanted to confront him. I didn't, because silence was doing more damage than any argument ever could. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more confident they became. They thought the danger had passed. They didn't realize the danger hadn't even started yet. There wasn't a single dramatic moment where I suddenly snapped. No shouting, no breaking point. What pushed me forward was something quieter. Clarity. It happened on an ordinary evening. I came home earlier than usual. The kids were already asleep. The house was quiet. My wife was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand. She didn't hear me come in. She was smiling, not politely, not out of habit, genuinely. For a second, I just stood there and watched her. She looked relaxed, unburdened, happy. And not because of me. That was the moment something settled inside me. Not anger, not sadness, acceptance. She hadn't made a mistake. She hadn't been confused. She had chosen, and she was comfortable with that choice. When she finally noticed me, she locked her phone and asked if everything was okay. I said yes, and for the first time in months, I meant it. Because I finally knew exactly what I was going to do. The next day, I met with my lawyer again, not to ask questions, to give instructions. We talked about timing, about custody, about documentation, about what mattered and what didn't. I didn't rush. I waited until everything was ready. When I told my wife I wanted a divorce, she didn't see it coming. She stared at me for a long moment, like she was waiting for the rest of the sentence. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, because she thought I was bluffing. When she realized I wasn't, her tone changed. She asked if we could talk about it, if we could slow down, if we could avoid lawyers. She said things like, "Let's not make this ugly," and "We can figure this out." I told her I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was protecting myself and the kids. That's when fear finally showed up. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing control. A few days later, I submitted everything to HR. Not accusations, not opinions, evidence, dates, emails, timelines, conflicts of interest. I didn't ask for action. I let the facts speak. After that, things moved quietly. Meetings started happening that I wasn't invited to. This time, I didn't wonder why. My boss stopped making eye contact, stopped smiling. He started leaving early, arriving late. At home, the atmosphere collapsed. My wife moved between anger and panic. One day she blamed me. The next, she begged. The kids sensed something was wrong before we ever said a word. The court process was slow, cold. There were no emotional speeches, no dramatic moments, just records, schedules, patterns, and facts don't care how anyone feels. When the custody decision came through, I felt relief before anything else. Not victory, relief. I hadn't lost my kids. She didn't fight as hard as I expected. Maybe she knew, or maybe she was exhausted. Around the same time, my boss stopped showing up to work altogether. At first, people said he was on leave. Then they stopped mentioning him. A month later, his position appeared online. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. I never spoke to him again. Not once. And I didn't need to. Because by then, everything that needed to be said had already been said by the consequences. After everything was set in motion, nothing happened fast. That surprised me. There was no dramatic fallout at first. No screaming phone calls. No public scandal. Just silence. At work, people stopped asking questions. Not because they didn't care, because they already knew enough. My boss didn't come in 1 week. At first, it was explained as personal time. Then, his name stopped coming up at all. A few weeks later, his position quietly appeared online. No announcement, no goodbye email, no farewell meeting. He simply vanished from the company like someone who had never really belonged there. At home, the shift was louder. The house felt different immediately. Not empty, just exposed. My wife moved out not long after the paperwork started. There were no long conversations about closure, no final arguments that solved anything. We spoke about schedules, about the kids, about logistics. That was it. The kids struggled at first. Questions they didn't know how to ask, emotions they couldn't explain. I focused on consistency. Same mornings, same dinners, same routines. I learned quickly that stability matters more than explanations. The custody arrangement settled into something manageable. Not perfect, but fair. Enough to know my kids were safe. Enough to know I wouldn't lose them. That mattered more than anything else. As for my ex-wife, she tried to reach out more than once. Not to reconcile, to explain. She wanted to control the story, to soften it, to reframe what had happened. I didn't engage. Some stories don't need editing. They need distance. Life didn't suddenly become better. It became quieter, cleaner. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. Stopped wondering what was being hidden from me. I slept better. Not because I was happy, because I wasn't lying to myself anymore. At work, my role changed. More responsibility. More visibility. Not as a reward, as a correction. People started asking my opinion again, inviting me into rooms I hadn't been in for a long time. I noticed something interesting. The louder people are about power, the faster it disappears. The quieter it is, the longer it lasts. I don't trust as easily now, but when I do, it's intentional. I pay attention to patterns, to timing, to what people do when they think no one is watching. I lost a marriage. I lost the version of my life where trust was automatic. But I kept my kids, my career, and my sense of control. I didn't destroy anyone. I didn't need to. I just stopped protecting a reality that wasn't real anymore. And once I did that, everything they built in the dark collapsed on its own. My wife cheated on me with my boss, and now their lives are smaller. Not because I took something from them, but because I finally stopped holding everything together.